"I'm too old to travel," said Margaret Ellis, a 68-year-old retired school counselor from Asheville, North Carolina. She said it softly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. It wasn't bitterness, just quiet acceptance, the kind that settles in when years start blending together. Her passport had long expired, her suitcase stored behind old coats, and her world had grown comfortable but small. The idea of travel now felt distant, almost unreasonable. Airports, heavy bags, strange streets, those belonged to younger people, not to her. Yet, every time she watched a travel show, she caught herself leaning forward, eyes softening at the sight of faraway places. Paris lights shimmering over the river. Markets alive with color and laughter. Waves breaking against foreign shores. She never said it out loud, but a small part of her heart still ached for motion. Still ached for discovery. The truth was, it wasn't age holding her back, it was the story she'd told herself about age. And that quiet story, repeated for years, had become her world. What she didn't realize yet was that the world hadn't stopped waiting for her. At 63, Margaret's life had quietly folded into a pattern she could predict down to the hour. Mornings began with coffee on the same porch, afternoons with gentle chores and crossword puzzles, evenings wrapped in the soft hum of television. Her husband's passing had left the house quieter, her children's visits less frequent as their own lives grew busier. It wasn't loneliness exactly, just an absence of motion, a life that had stopped stretching. "My days all look the same," she admitted once, half smiling, half sad. She told herself it was peace, but in truth it felt like pause. The walls that once held laughter now felt too still, the comfort of routine turning heavy with time. Beneath the quiet was a restlessness she couldn't name, a whisper that rose whenever she looked out the window at planes tracing the sky. She wasn't longing for adventure, she was longing to feel her own life moving again. And one ordinary afternoon, something inside her finally stirred. On her 65th birthday, Margaret climbed the attic stairs, moving carefully, one hand steady on the railing and the other carrying a box of old linens. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of scent that only time can make. Light filtered in through a small round window, catching the edges of forgotten boxes labeled with decades she could barely remember writing. She had told herself she was only tidying, but deep down, she knew she was searching for something, she just didn't know what. The house below had been too quiet lately. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded lonely. She brushed a strand of gray hair behind her ear and reached for a box at the back, one marked Memories. It was heavier than she expected. Inside were photo albums, a few of David's old letters, and at the bottom, something round wrapped in yellowed newspaper. When she peeled the paper back, her breath caught. It was the globe. The one he had given her the year they married. Its oceans had faded to a dusty teal, and its countries looked softer around the edges, as if the world itself had been worn down by time. A small sticky note clung to its side near Greece, the ink just visible. In David's handwriting were 3 simple words, "Our dream trip." Margaret sat down slowly on the attic floor. The wood was cold beneath her, grounding her as she turned the globe in her hands. Her fingertips traced the faint line between Asheville and Athens, following the path they had once promised to take together. She could almost hear his voice again, calm, certain, teasing her about how she'd overpack, how she'd bring her gardening gloves just in case. The sound of it filled her head until the silence became unbearable. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and whispered, "If not now, when?" The words came out cracked but alive, a small spark in the stillness. For the first time in years, she didn't feel old. She just felt unfinished. She stayed there for a while, the globe resting on her knees, the note trembling in her hand. The attic seemed to breathe with her, like the world was listening. When she finally stood, she didn't rush to put the globe back. She carried it downstairs and placed it on the table beside her teacup, as if it was something new, something waiting. That night, Margaret opened a notebook and drew 2 columns, one titled Reasons to Stay, the other Reasons to Go. The first list came easily: money, safety, habit, fear. The second stayed blank for a long time. Then she wrote one word, me. Under it, she added, because I'm still here. The next morning, she made a call to a local senior travel club. The woman who answered had a kind voice, steady and encouraging. They talked about accessible tours, gentle pacing, group safety, details Margaret had once used as excuses not to go. But that morning, they felt like doorways instead of barriers. She hung up and went straight to the post office to renew her passport. When the clerk asked if she was planning a trip, she smiled softly and said, "Yes. I think I am." The clerk nodded, stamping the papers. "Good for you," she said. Margaret nodded back, her eyes warm but sure. It wasn't excitement she felt, it was readiness. For the first time in a long while, she was making a decision that belonged entirely to her. When she returned home, she placed the globe on the mantel. The sticky note still clung to it, fragile but stubborn, the way hope always is. It didn't look like a keepsake anymore. It looked like a promise waiting to be kept. Portugal was the first stamp in her new passport, the first promise she kept to herself. The flight from North Carolina to Lisbon felt endless, her nerves buzzing the entire way. She clutched her boarding pass like an anchor, whispering silent reassurances she didn't quite believe. When the plane touched down, her hands trembled. She was 65, alone, and halfway across the world. For a moment, she questioned everything, her age, her courage, her sanity. But when she stepped out of the airport and felt the warm Portuguese sun on her face, something inside her softened. The fear was still there, but it wasn't leading anymore. It was following. Her first few days were quiet. She stayed at a small hotel tucked between pastel buildings on a narrow street paved with patterned stones. The mornings smelled of sea salt and strong coffee. From her window, she could see the city waking up, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, church bells echoing from hilltops, the golden light crawling across the rooftops. She walked slowly, taking in every detail, her steps uncertain but her eyes wide open. The rhythm of Lisbon was different, slower, more forgiving. It didn't rush her, it invited her. She joined a senior travel group called the Wonder Years, made up of retirees from all over the world. Some were widowed, some divorced, some simply curious, but all of them were learning the same thing: the world hadn't forgotten them. They visited markets that smelled of roasted chestnuts and oranges, and she smiled at how easily laughter came, even between people who didn't share a language. She learned that kindness didn't need translation, and that strangers could feel like friends by the second cup of tea. One afternoon, she sat on a stone bench overlooking the Tagus River, watching waves brush gently against the old harbor walls. A street musician played an old guitar nearby, his melody soft and wistful. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sound fill her, the warmth of the sun seeping through her blouse. For the first time in years, she felt unhurried, present in her own skin. She realized that travel didn't need to be brave or bold. It just needed to be felt. That evening, her group took a tram up to the Alfama district. The streets were steep and uneven, lined with laundry hanging from balconies. She laughed breathlessly with another traveler as they climbed the narrow steps, each one feeling like a victory. Inside a small restaurant, they shared bread, olive oil, and laughter that came easy and full. When a local singer began to perform fado, Margaret found herself crying quietly, not from sadness but from the strange beauty of it all. Every note seemed to echo a truth she hadn't had words for: life doesn't stop being beautiful just because it slows down. In Portugal, Margaret discovered that curiosity doesn't fade with age, it waits patiently for us to slow down enough to notice again. Each morning brought a new rhythm, a new color, a new face. And every night, she wrote in her journal, her words simple but alive: I am not too old. I am just in a new chapter. Portugal was supposed to be a single trip, a gentle test of courage. But when wonder wakes, it doesn't go back to sleep. One trip turned into 30. What began as a single, cautious step into Portugal grew into a rhythm Margaret couldn't let go of. She promised herself one journey a year, but by the second year, she had already booked 3. The world opened its arms to her, and she found herself saying yes more often, to invitations, to day tours, to life itself. She explored Italy's countryside by train, sipping espresso in small cafes where no one hurried her to leave. In Morocco, she wandered through spice markets that smelled of saffron and orange peel, laughing with vendors who called her Madam Sunshine. In Thailand, she took a cooking class and discovered the joy of creating something new with hands that had spent decades tending gardens instead of spices. Each country added something to her: A little courage, a little light, a little more trust in herself. Over time, Margaret learned how to travel smart. She became what travel blogs now call an active ager, one of a growing generation of older adults redefining what retirement looks like. She used technology to make every trip accessible and safe. Translation apps, medical alert devices, digital maps with step-free routes. She booked flights with longer layovers to avoid rushing, chose hotels with elevators and on-site staff trained in senior care, and used insurance plans designed specifically for travelers over 65. For the first time, she felt the world had caught up to her instead of leaving her behind. Her confidence grew alongside her passport stamps. By her third year of travel, she was planning trips without tour groups, organizing her own itineraries through online communities for senior travelers. She joined a network of women over 60 who shared travel tips, safety advice, and even met up abroad. She found friendship in the most unexpected places. 2 widows from Canada she met in Florence, a retired librarian from Denver she shared a taxi with in Buenos Aires, and a group of seniors from Tokyo who adopted her into their dinner table in Kyoto. She didn't just see new places, she started to see herself differently. I used to help students find their confidence, she told a friend during a video call from Spain. Now I'm finding mine. The woman who once hesitated to drive beyond her hometown was now navigating train stations in languages she couldn't speak, relying on kindness, patience, and the quiet belief that she belonged wherever she stood. She collected more than souvenirs. She collected moments. Like the time she got lost in a back street in Rome and ended up being invited to lunch by an elderly couple who ran a tiny restaurant. Or the morning in Argentina when she danced tango in a plaza, her steps small but joyful. Or the temple visit in Japan where she sat beside a stranger and, without words, shared an entire hour of silence that felt like understanding. Every trip became a thread in the tapestry of her second life. The world was no longer distant, it was familiar, like a friend who welcomed her back each time with something new to teach. And though she loved every destination, the art of Florence, the food of Bangkok, the music of Havana, it wasn't the places that changed her most. It was the realization that she could still change it all. For the first time in years, Margaret felt capable, not of doing something extraordinary, but of simply living fully again. She no longer measured her days by what she'd lost but by what she could still discover. Her journals filled with notes that read less like travel logs and more like affirmations. I walked farther than I planned today. I wasn't afraid to ask for help. I laughed until my sides hurt. I am still learning. By her 5th year, she had visited 30 countries. 30 different corners of the world, each one leaving a mark. Sometimes she traveled alone, sometimes with groups, sometimes with new friends she met along the way. What mattered most wasn't how far she went, it was how far she'd come from the woman who once whispered, "I'm too old to travel." Every trip began the same way, a flutter of nerves, a deep breath, a promise to herself that she would keep going. Because now she knew that wonder wasn't a gift of youth, it was the reward of curiosity. And the more she fed it, the more alive she felt. Travel tested Margaret in ways she never could have planned for. There were missed flights that left her sitting quietly in unfamiliar airports, waiting for the next connection with nothing but patience and a paperback to pass the time. There were hotel mix-ups that landed her in rooms up too many stairs or down long hallways she hadn't expected to walk. Once, she arrived in Italy only to discover her luggage had taken a different route entirely and wouldn't return for 3 days. She laughed about it later, saying it was the universe's way of reminding her that you only really need half of what you pack. The worst moment came during her second winter abroad, when a snowstorm grounded every flight out of London. She spent Christmas Eve in the airport terminal, sitting on a stiff plastic chair surrounded by strangers who looked just as weary. She could have cried, but instead she watched a group of young travelers share cookies and stories, and before long, she was part of it, passing around her own chocolates, listening to their laughter echo off the tall windows. Every mishap is part of the map, she said, smiling through the fatigue. Even her body had its limits, and travel didn't always let her forget that. In Morocco, she tripped on a cobblestone street and spent a week limping, refusing to let it ruin her trip. Locals greeted her with kindness, bringing her tea and teaching her phrases in Arabic that meant slow and steady. She learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was connection. With every challenge came a lesson, and with every small victory came gratitude. She started preparing differently, learning that foresight was its own kind of freedom. She carried a small first aid kit, a portable charger, printed copies of her itinerary, and her prescriptions tucked neatly into a waterproof pouch. Before every trip, she made sure her insurance covered medical support abroad. And though she traveled independently, she always left her plans with her daughter, just in case. She had grown cautious, yes, but also wiser, sharper, more assured. What once might have frightened her now only reminded her how capable she was. Modern travel had grown kinder to seniors, too. Airports offered wheelchairs and escorts on request. Many hotels had begun designing senior-accessible suites, elevators close to rooms, grab bars in bathrooms, staff trained to notice when someone might need a steadier arm. Even airlines now offered senior boarding assistance, giving her time to settle in without rush. She noticed these things and appreciated them, not as privileges but as small gestures of respect that said, "You still belong here." Her resilience became her compass. Every hiccup in the plan became a story she'd later tell with a grin. Like the time her tour bus broke down in Argentina and the group turned the wait into a roadside picnic, or when she got lost in a narrow alley in Kyoto and a kind shopkeeper walked her all the way back to her hotel. "You find out who you are when things don't go as planned," she wrote in her journal. "I used to fear the unexpected. Now, I count on it." She learned to move slower, to rest when needed, to treat fatigue not as a failure but as part of the rhythm. She carried herself with calm awareness, meeting delays and detours with the grace of someone who finally understood that perfection was never the goal. Travel didn't just test her patience, it refined it. It taught her that strength isn't loud or bold, sometimes it's the quiet act of staying soft when the day gets hard. With every obstacle, she grew steadier, not smaller. And with every new test, she found herself laughing a little sooner, worrying a little less. The challenges had given her stories she'd never forget, but what surprised her most was that, through it all, it was the people who found her when things went wrong who became the soul of her journey. Margaret discovered early in her travels that the beauty of the world wasn't only in the landscapes, it was in the people who filled them. From a tea seller in Vietnam who smiled as he poured her cup just the way she liked it, to an elderly grandmother in Ireland who insisted she come inside, just for a biscuit and a bit of warmth, Margaret learned that kindness spoke every language. Each encounter left a small mark, something gentle and lasting. She began keeping a special section in her travel journal, a kind of living gratitude list, where she wrote down the names and moments that made each country feel like a heartbeat rather than a destination. There was the woman in Tokyo who wordlessly shared her umbrella during an unexpected rainstorm, both of them walking shoulder to shoulder down the crowded street without a single word exchanged. The young boy in Ecuador who taught her simple Spanish phrases, laughing each time she mispronounced them, then proudly introduced her to his mother, who hugged her like family. In Thailand, a street artist painted her portrait on a piece of scrap paper and handed it to her saying, "You smile with your eyes, keep doing that." Margaret tucked it into her notebook and still carries it to this day. In every country, she found that strangers often gave her what she didn't even know she needed: connection, warmth, the reminder that humanity still hums quietly beneath all the noise of the world. She realized that travel wasn't about sightseeing anymore, it was about soul-seeing, meeting people not for what they could show her, but for who they were. Each conversation, every shared meal, every unexpected kindness stitched itself into her story. Some encounters lasted an hour, others an evening, but all of them lingered like echoes. She often thought of David and how he would have loved these moments. The world, she realized, was full of gentle hands that still reached out, full of laughter that didn't need translation. Research in 2025 had shown what she was already living, that seniors who stay socially active experience higher emotional well-being, stronger memory, and longer life satisfaction. Margaret didn't need the study to believe it, she felt it in her bones. Connection had become her medicine. "Every person I meet adds a little more color to who I am," she wrote one night in Spain after dinner with a group of travelers half her age who had hung on her every story. "The world isn't getting smaller. My heart is getting bigger." She found herself saying yes more often, to conversations, to company, to invitations from people she might once have been too shy to approach. On a train ride through France, She shared her lunch with a couple celebrating their 50th anniversary. In return, they shared their wine and a story about their first trip together, both of them laughing so freely it made her heart ache in the best way. In Kenya, a young guide told her, "You are proof that courage grows older too," and she cried quietly in the jeep, turning her face toward the sun so no one would see. Every connection, no matter how small, became a thread in a tapestry she hadn't known she was weaving. She realized that the people she met weren't just characters in her travels, they were reminders of how deeply human we all are, no matter our language or our age. With every handshake, hug, or shared laugh, Margaret felt something inside her soften, stretch, and heal. She wasn't just exploring the world anymore. The world, in all its kindness, was helping her rediscover herself. At 68, Margaret stood stronger, calmer, and more alive than she had ever been. The woman who once measured her life in quiet routines now measured it in memories, in moments, in miles walked through streets she once couldn't have found on a map. She no longer introduced herself as retired, she called herself a traveler, a learner, a late-blooming adventurer. The word retired had begun to sound like a full stop, and her life had proven to be anything but. The loneliness that used to fill her house had been replaced with postcards and handwritten letters from friends scattered across continents. Her mantle was lined with photos, her and an elephant guide in Thailand, a group of laughing women she'd met in Florence, a quiet sunset over Lisbon. Her scrapbook had grown thick, its pages crowded with ticket stubs, pressed flowers, and scribbled notes from people she'd met along the way. She often said, "I didn't run away from aging. I just decided to walk beside it, with a suitcase in my hand." The line always made people laugh, but to her, it was the truth. She hadn't escaped getting older, she had simply learned to greet it like an old friend and ask, "What now?" The mirror still showed wrinkles, but they no longer felt like loss, they looked like maps of everywhere she'd been. Travel had changed more than her scenery, it had changed her spirit. She had learned patience in airport lines, humility in translation errors, joy in getting lost, and gratitude in being found. She no longer chased the idea of youth. She didn't need to. Youth, she'd realized, was just the early version of curiosity, and curiosity was something she had in abundance. Studies had begun to confirm what Margaret was living every day, that seniors who travel regularly experience stronger confidence, sharper minds, and a deeper sense of purpose. She didn't need to read about it in a report, she felt it every morning when she woke up excited for whatever the day would bring. Her fear of time had been replaced with friendship toward it. She laughed easily now, especially at herself, at her mispronounced words, at her tendency to take too many photos of her meals, at how she still packed too much even after 30 trips. But there was pride there too, quiet and certain. She had stepped out of a life that was shrinking and into one that expanded with every sunrise. When people asked her why she traveled so much, she answered simply, "Because it keeps me awake." She meant more than awake in the morning, she meant awake to the small miracles most people overlook. She noticed everything now, the warmth of sunlight on her hands, the sound of unfamiliar music drifting through a cafe, the ease that came from realizing she was still becoming. She had stopped seeing her age as an ending and started seeing it as the perfect time to begin. For Margaret, aging was not about losing energy, it was about gaining meaning. She often said, "I'm not trying to be who I was. I'm becoming who I still want to be." And somehow, with every journey, that became true. But Margaret's story didn't stop at 30 countries. Something new was already calling her, something quieter, deeper, and closer to the heart. Today Margaret travels slower but deeper, her journey's less about the number of stamps in her passport and more about the roots she plants wherever she goes. After 30 countries, she's learned that meaning doesn't live in movement, it lives in connection. She now volunteers each spring at a botanical garden in Costa Rica, tending orchids and teaching visiting children the names of plants in English and Spanish. The scent of soil and flowers brings her peace, a reminder that growth happens quietly even after long winters. In Thailand, she spends part of the year helping young students practice English, her gentle patience earning her the nickname Teacher Maggie. Between trips, she runs an online mentorship circle for senior women who dream of traveling but feel unsure where to start. Every week, she hosts video calls, walking them through safety steps, budget planning, and the emotional side of beginning again at 60 or 70. She often tells them, "The best souvenir is the person you become when you say yes." That line has become something of a motto, shared again and again in online senior travel forums. What began as her personal healing has become a ripple of inspiration. She's now part of a quiet movement of older adults who see aging not as retreat but as expansion, a chance to learn, to serve, to grow wider instead of smaller. Her blog, Miles Between Years, has found readers all over the world. In her posts, she doesn't write about luxury or checklist travel. She writes about kindness, discovery, and courage, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for perfect timing. She encourages her readers to start small. One road trip, one train ride, one walk through a new neighborhood. Curiosity, she writes, is the fuel that keeps us becoming. She believes everyone deserves to rediscover wonder, no matter their limitations, because there's always a way to travel, even if the trip begins in the mind or the garden just outside the door. These days, she keeps her suitcase half-packed but never rushed, her plans flexible, her pace unhurried. She's not chasing miles anymore, she's gathering meaning. When she sits on her porch back home in Asheville, the evening sun spilling over her journals and maps, she thinks about all the people she's met, all the corners of the world that changed her, and all the quiet yeses that brought her here. Her message to every senior is simple and unforgettable. Life doesn't end when routines begin, it ends when curiosity does. So, whatever your yes is, say it. Margaret Ellis's journey is proof that life after 60 isn't the end of discovery, it's the beginning of living with intention. She didn't run from age, she welcomed it, holding its hand like an old companion as she stepped into a wider world. Her story reminds us that aging isn't about shrinking into what's comfortable, it's about growing into what's possible. She showed that courage doesn't have an expiration date, and that wonder isn't something we outgrow, it's something we return to when we finally have the time to notice again. Margaret found that adventure doesn't belong to youth, it belongs to anyone who is still curious enough to say yes. Each journey she took wasn't about miles or countries, it was about the quiet bravery of saying, "I can still begin." She learned that every time she said yes, to a flight, a stranger's kindness, a walk through a new city, she became a little more herself. And maybe that's what this stage of life is really about, not chasing who we used to be, but meeting who we've become. For every senior watching who's ever thought, it's too late, Margaret's story stands as gentle proof, it isn't. The map of your life isn't finished. There are still blank spaces waiting to be explored, still friendships waiting to form, still dreams that didn't forget you. The world is wide, and it still has a place for your footsteps. So take that first small step, toward joy, toward curiosity, toward yourself. Because life doesn't stop being beautiful after 60, it just starts showing you a different kind of beauty, one you've earned the eyes to see. If Margaret's story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Seniors Wellbeing, and share it with someone who needs to remember, it's never too late to begin again. Whether your next journey is a short trip, a new hobby, or a long-held dream, let this be your quiet nudge forward. The best time to live fully isn't someday. It's today.